I asked myself a lot of these questions as I was going through the writing process and kind of coming up with what are the hardest parts of growing up and becoming conscious as you grow up about what you want and the life that you want to lead. And I don't know if you did this in middle school or high school, but they had us go through this process of like answering a bunch of questions, and then this computer generated program spit out these like top 5 answers of what you should be or what you should do as your career. And I just thought it was such an interesting example of how like our society works, and where we look to all these external factors of how we should feel and what we should do and who we should be. And I kind of just questioned, what if we were taught to just come up with our own like personal mission statement, or ask ourselves, who do I want to be when I get older, or even right now in this moment? And I think that deep reflection and questioning really needs to start at a young age, but obviously for many of us, it may not have, and it's a muscle that we need to kind of exercise over time.
I'm Casey Main, author, writer, and party girl turned spiritual junkie, and I'm dedicated to helping you better understand the most important and most complicated relationship you'll ever be in, the one you have with yourself. It's the only relationship that you're in for the entirety of your time here, and it affects every single aspect of your life. Yet it is the one most often overlooked. This podcast is here to help you explore that relationship, get to know yourself so you can accept yourself, heal yourself, and become a better version of yourself. So let's get to it. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Better You podcast. I am your host, Casey Main. As always, the first thing I want to say to you is thank you. Thank you for being here. If you've been following along for a while, thank you for coming back. If you're new to the show, then welcome to the party. As you heard in the intro, this podcast is really dedicated to better understanding our relationship with ourselves. And we approach that from all different angles with all different types of guests, but these are just the conversations that, I don't know, they energize me, they inspire me. And there was a time in my life where I felt really lost and kind of off, even though on the outside, like on paper, my life looked great, but I just felt like unfulfilled and uninspired. And it's like, these are the types of conversations I wish I had been listening to during that time, because I would have very quickly realized that I wasn't alone and that, you know, I could get through it, which I have, like everyone can get through it. But it's just, it's nice if you're just feeling off, or like there's something about your life that you want to change, or something that just doesn't feel right. It's really nice to know that that's not an uncommon feeling, and that other people have been through it or are in it currently, so that you feel less alone. And that's a little bit of like my story, and that's very much the story of this guest as well, and what she's dedicated her work to, and what I've dedicated my work to. So we've had a lot of similarities in the aspect that like you get out into life and, you know, adulthood, and for a lot of people, there's like a certain point where you realize this just doesn't feel right, or this wasn't what I was expecting, or I'm not as happy as I thought I would be, or I'm not as happy as I should be. And she made changes much, much earlier in life than I did. It took me, I didn't really start to change my life until I was 32. So it took me a minute, but I do remember feeling like that much earlier in life, like more around 24, 25. And I just like suppressed those feelings and just decided not to do anything with them, which, as we talk about in this episode, is not necessarily a bad thing. Like, the process of change takes a long time. And it actually, if I look back, like it all happened for a reason, because suppressing those feelings and continuing to live life the way that I was actually gave me really great material for the book that I ended up writing at 32, which was really the beginning of kind of what I would consider my awakening and really coming back to who I really am, and living a more fulfilling life. So I don't know. I say all that, I guess, to say that no matter where you are in that process. If you're just feeling like something is off, or if you've already made it through on the other side, or maybe you feel great, but I don't know, this phase of life could be coming your way. Like, you'll resonate with some of the stuff that we talk about. She's just like very real, very down to earth, very insightful. So I think you guys are really gonna enjoy this conversation. Before we get into it, quick reminder, and I'm probably going to include this in episodes for the rest of the year, just kind of the plan. So there will be new episodes of the podcast through November. And then in December, I'm going to take a little bit of time off so that I can really go into planning mode for 2021. And so December, I was looking at it earlier, there's actually 5 Tuesdays in December. So 4 of those episodes will be like best of episodes. And I'm not going to go best of just 2020. I'm going to go best of the podcast so far, since the podcast is only like a year and a half old. So I will pick my favorite episodes, or I'd actually really love to hear what your favorite episodes have been. So if you've got a favorite or even a couple favorites, message me through social media or shoot me an email at thebetteryoupodcast@gmail.com and let me know what some of your favorites have been and why. And then that can help me determine which ones to like re-air in December. But then I've decided the last episode of this year, so I think it's Tuesday, December 29th, I'm going to do a solo episode. And part of the reason I'm announcing this is for accountability reasons, to make sure I actually do it. But I'm going to do 21 life lessons for 2021, because last year I did 20 life lessons for 2020. And that was actually a really popular episode. It took me a while to prepare for it and do it, but it was a good exercise for me to kind of look back through the year of things that I've written or different conversations we've had on the podcast and kind of my biggest takeaways or like aha moments. And I want to do that again because it was very helpful for me. And then judging from the response I got, I think it was very helpful and inspiring for a lot of other people. So December will be, 4 reruns of favorite episodes. And then the final episode of the year will be 21 life lessons for 2021. Okay, so another thing I just kind of wanted to share, and this is a little random. I haven't done anything like this in the intro before, but I don't know. I had this idea this morning because if you follow me, probably my writing account at Casey Main Writes, if you follow that on Instagram, then you've probably noticed like I've been thinking a lot recently about self-care and finding time, like quiet time to be alone, preferably like out in nature. And that's something I used to have a lot of that in my life when I was single and I lived alone and I had a regular steady job with a secure income. And it was a lot easier to fit all of that, like quiet alone time and reading and listening to podcasts and walking on the beach and watching the sunrise and all that stuff. It was great. But I'm in a different season of life now. And so it's harder to find that time or make that time. And I've been thinking about that a lot recently and trying to find a way to fit it into how my life works now in a way that's realistic, but not like beat myself up because it doesn't look how it used to. And I came across this book that I read back in my, kind of during my awakening, I guess, or during the time of life where I was really dedicated to self-care and in a super self-reflective phase of life. It was like right after I wrote my book and I was getting into all this writing and everything. And I came across this book that I read. It's called Outrageous Openness, Letting the Divine Take the Lead. And it's by Tasha Silver. This book was recommended to me actually by a hypnotherapist that I went and saw after I read the book, Many Lives, Many Masters, which if you've been listening to the podcast for a while, I've probably mentioned that book in like 18 episodes, no joke, because it was such a life-changing book for me. But she recommended this book and I read it. It was just an easy read. It was really great. And in the end, she shares this, I'm not going to say it's a prayer. It's almost like a poem, but I loved it so much that I really, for I don't know how long, I used to read this every morning before I left the house to go to work. And I'm going to share it now, like I'm going to read it now. So we're going to have story time because I think it'll help get us all in the mindset for this conversation, as well as so many other conversations we've had on the podcast that really talk about like letting go and kind of surrendering to life, whether you want to call that God or the universe or whatever aligns with your beliefs. And really this power of like trusting the process and trusting that there's a higher power or energy or intelligence, like whatever you want to call it, that is working with you and not against you. And I don't know. I refound this book and I've started reading this again. When I read it for myself, I actually change it to be in the first person so that it's almost like a mantra or like something like a pep talk I'm giving myself, but I'm going to read it just as it is in the book now. And I will link to this book in the show notes so that you guys can check it out if you want to. It was a quick read. It was a great read. And then it ends with this awesome poem or prayer or whatever we're going to call it. Okay, so here goes. Something happens after you align with the divine for a while. You begin to feel on a cellular level that things are unfolding exactly in the way that they should, at the rate and timing they need. You start to trust the process. You relax from the endless pushing that most of us learned at birth. On some fundamental, mysterious level, you just let go. Not with that bitterness people feel when they fear the ego's dreams won't occur. Not with passivity as right actions do get shown. Rather, you relax into this calm curiosity about where the flow might go. You're detached yet somehow riveted by how the story will unfold. You feel spaciously receptive and open to what wishes to come. You give it all room to blossom. You trust the highest, one way or another, eventually will unfold. You know that with God as your source, you needn't cling to any one plan, and you're not clutching a list of desires, pushing the ego's agenda even more. When you're in cycles of quiet and waiting, you catch your breath, knowing the wheel again will turn. You rest because as the right actions get revealed, a lot will arise to be done. You wait for the signs and the timing rather than rip open the cocoon. You trust that delays might be welcome. You trust that delays can be good. You trust that delays are all perfect. And you stay present just to witness your own birth. So I don't know, there's something about that I've got goosebumps even as I read it. I love, and I think it is this great reminder of a concept that comes up in so many episodes, is that trusting your own process, trusting the process of this greater power or intelligence or life or universe that's working with us, like accepting yourself as you go, recognizing that there are seasons in life. So there's going to be times for, lots of action and times where you just kind of step back and wait. And I don't know, just trusting that that's all, it's all on purpose and it's all for a greater good and for your greater good. So I share that just to help us kind of all get in a good mindset for this conversation. Again, I will link to that book in the show notes, as well as other people and books that we discuss in this episode that will all be in the show notes. And then I also want to recommend a couple previous episodes, especially if you are new to the podcast and you enjoy some of the topics we talk about in today's episode, then go back into the archives and listen to episode 70, Balancing Taking Care of Yourself and Being There for Others with Asha Terry. There's a lot of really great little golden nuggets in that episode. And Asha actually also has a lot of work dedicated to working specifically with millennials. Also, episode 69, Breathing Through Stress and Anxiety with Dr. Emma Sevala. This is a really interesting one and kind of like a science-backed one. And she also wrote a book about happiness, which ties in nicely because we talk about happiness a lot in this episode. And then also episode 63, Eastern Philosophy and Living Meditation for Your Life with Dr. Janelle Kim. This is, I love this one because it really takes these Eastern philosophy principles, but then she positions them in a very realistic way of how to incorporate them into your life, which will just help with all the things we talk about in today's episode in terms of figuring out what is really right for you versus what you've kind of been going through because society tells you to, and finding the quiet time and being intentional with choices and all that stuff. Okay, so let's talk about today's guest. Katina Mountanos is a renowned writer and creative entrepreneur who founded On Adulting, the viral blog and community in 2016 to help her fellow millennials navigate adulthood in a mindful and happy way. Her work has been featured in Teen Vogue, Fast Company, Huffington Post, Mindbodygreen, Elite Daily, and other publications. Katina graduated from NYU's Stern School of Business in 2014 and began her career in data analytics at Goldman Sachs. She quickly realized her deep desire for social impact, helping to formalize and lead Goldman's environmental sustainability work, moving into philanthropic consulting soon after. Katina's early career has largely focused on bending the rules for good. Most recently, she co-founded a mental well-being startup called Daydreamers to redefine how we all spend our free time. Katina is currently pursuing her master's in clinical psychology from Columbia University. She lives in Brooklyn and around the world with her fiance and rescue pup. In this episode, we discuss why she started writing about the difficulties she was facing transitioning into adulthood after college, which eventually became her very popular blog On Adulting. How our upbringing and the people in our lives can impact the career options we define as successful. How our definition of happiness and our strive for it can actually cause us to be unhappy. The power of questioning everything so you can define your own terms for life and happiness. How making changes in your life is a process and you should move through the process at a pace that feels right to you. The shift from looking to the external for answers on what you should do with your life and who you should be to listening to and trusting yourself. The importance of identifying who you want to be, not just what you want to be. Our tendency to negotiate our values to fit into certain societal boxes. The impact growing up with technology and social media, as well as a different type of parenting, has had on the millennial generation. And some small things that we can all do that will make big differences in our lives and our happiness. One more quick note before we jump into this conversation. Towards the end of it, we talk about gratitude and the important role that like having a gratitude practice can have in your life. And I used to keep a gratitude journal. So it was like this little notebook I kept by my bed. And before I went to sleep every night, I'd write like at least 5 things that I was grateful for. And I'm not sure how long I kept that up, but it was for a good amount of time. And now that's one of those practices I just haven't been able to restart in my new phase of life. And then I feel bad about it. And then I'm like, okay, that's not the point of a gratitude journal. And I recently found this really new, like innovative type of gratitude journal. So it was created by actually this mushroom coffee company that I just absolutely love and drink all the time. It's called Ryze, R-Y-Z-E. So it's this, it's a mushroom coffee. And so it's got all these great adaptogenic mushrooms in it. So if you're not familiar with like the power of mushrooms, you might want to look into it because it's really cool stuff, really good for your brain. And then this coffee has like less caffeine, which allows me to drink more of it and still kind of maintain like not a crazy amount of caffeine throughout the day, which as a writer and somebody who works from coffee shops a lot, I can tend to maybe drink too much caffeine and then that hurts my sleep and all that stuff. Anyways, that's a little bit of a rabbit hole, but they created this gratitude journal that is text-based. So you get a text message every morning, or you can choose what time is best for you that asks like a question that's a great prompt for gratitude. So you get these text messages and then you respond via text answering the question and it logs all your answers online. So like in a journal, in your own little private account, it's creating a journal, but you're able to do it just from your phone and texting, which I don't know. It's easier for me to maintain that right now than to pick up an actual journal like that's sitting next to my bed, which seems silly, but I'm sure you guys can relate. So I'll link to that in the show notes as well in case you guys want to try it out. It's relatively new, but so far I've had no issues with it. It's working really well. And I don't know, it's been a great way to put some gratitude back in my life. Even if I don't respond via text message, getting the question and reading it at least gets me thinking about it, which as we talk about in this episode, just that even those little baby steps that don't seem like they're action-oriented steps are important steps. Okay, so this is a super long intro. I apologize for that. I'm going to stop talking and we're going to go ahead and jump into this amazing conversation with Katina. So I want to start with just a little bit of backstory on how you came to start the blog on adulting. Like, how did that come to be?
Yeah, definitely. So I started on adulting in a really interesting way. Actually, when I first graduated from college, I started working at an investment bank in New York City, which is very different than writing career. But almost immediately when I got there, I knew that I had this passion for storytelling that wasn't necessarily being met in this new world of adulthood that I was entering. So that was kind of back when blogs were really not necessarily a normal thing to be working on. So I actually started writing in a massive Word document, which was really like a reflection essentially of why adulthood was so difficult and weird and confusing for me, and what was so different about my life before that felt much better. And I would send it out in these little vignettes, or what I called chapters back then, in an email chain to family and close friends, and would kind of get their feedback. And it was almost like an old school blog. And it wasn't until about a year and a half later when I ended up transitioning to a new role at a philanthropic venture fund, where I started to feel a little more comfortable sharing my story publicly with strangers. So I actually ended up starting to write on Medium, which was really new at the time. And from there, it kind of, I would share it on Facebook with, the people that I knew. And my mom was really the only one that was consistently supporting me. And I'm sure anyone who, has ever dabbled in blogging, that there's something that's really just pulling at you to continue sharing your story. So I ended up kind of following that voice, and I was still working full time for quite a while I was writing, and like staying up late and thinking of new stories to put out and reflections, and really just treated it like my public journal. Mm-hmm. So quite an evolution.
So, all right, I'm just a little bit curious, if you don't mind sharing, like, what year was this? Like, when did you graduate college?
Yeah. So I actually graduated a semester early from NYU. I was in the business school there in undergrad. And I started work in the summer of 2014. So I didn't start on adulting until like 2016, about probably halfway through the year.
Okay. Wow. Yeah. So that's so funny that you like started blogging before it was really a thing, and that you did it in a Word document, which then when you did finally bring it online, I feel like that was probably really good timing, because my guess is there weren't as many blogs out there at the time. So there was like less noise, which probably was like a really good thing for your blog.
Totally. Yeah. It's really interesting. I feel like around the time that I started writing publicly, Instagram was still like quite new, and there wasn't even really a word for influencers yet. I guess maybe in some like fashion arenas, but not really in the like wellness space and mindfulness space. So it was really interesting, because I was really against social media for a long time. And I was like, I'm just going to be writing, on my own website or on Medium or on different websites that I look up to, and kind of guest writing for them. And I am not starting an Instagram or anything like that. Like, I don't want to be in that space. And it wasn't something I used personally either. So when I finally created a social media handle for On Adulting, it was really probably around the time that a lot of people started like becoming I really hate the word influencer, but, you know, sharing their own story, I guess, through social media in a more deep and authentic way. So it was a really interesting time that was when I kind of got started.
Yeah. Oh, that's so funny. So we're a little bit kindred spirits because I was against all of social media when it all first started happening. I joke that I'm the same age as Facebook because Mark Zuckerberg created it when he was in college and I was in college at the time. So when it first came out, like it was only for college people. But I remember thinking like, I'm not joining that. I'm not joining any of this. And then I caved sometime in my like early 20s, but I joined MySpace because I thought that one was the cooler one. And then of course that didn't live, and Facebook then ran the world, and then Instagram. And it's just amazing how all that happened so quickly. I'm curious. So what was your major in school? Was it something in the finance industry?
Yes, so different than what I'm doing right now. But I actually went to undergrad, as I said, at NYU Stern School of Business. I'm from Long Island, so it wasn't too far from my family. And I always thought that I wanted to start a business myself. I come from a family of immigrants and small business owners, so I kind of connected the word business with small businesses. And then when I got to Stern, I was blown away by how many people just were wearing suits and knew what the word investment banking was and kind of had this very clear path of what they were studying and why. And interestingly, I'd always been really passionate about writing, but kind of suppressed that, I guess, because society tells us, especially for women when I was growing up, that math and science were the thing that you should do. And, you know, that's like where success lies. And
it's like writing was just not, it wasn't on my radar at all as an option for a career. Like at all. Like writing as part of, like I was a communications major. So writing as it lived in the PR world or the marketing world, sure. But like I never ever had the thought, oh, and I did like to write all growing up. And I never had the thought, oh, like I could make a career out of this, because we grow up with these, probably depending a lot on your immediate surroundings, what jobs or roles are considered ideal or the norm or where you should go. And then it's like, we just are like, have blinders on to any of the millions of other options, especially ones that may be tied to things we're actually passionate about, which then is an issue.
Totally. Oh my gosh. I'm sure we'll get to this later, but I write about this so much in the On Adulting book. And in like the first intro chapter, I talk about how when I was younger, I always wanted to be a writer and it was such a dream for me, but I quickly caught on that, like, at least in the circles that I ran in, or my family's perception of success was like becoming a CEO or a doctor or a lawyer. So those were really the only paths that, in order to kind of get out of this class and status that my family was in as, you know, immigrants in a lower middle class town and existence, was to become something of that nature. So yes, in college, I very much was on that path and followed those rules, and definitely didn't even open my eyes to another potential career at all.
You know, it's so interesting because I feel like depending on where you come from in life, like the messaging is a little bit different, but it's like the end goal we're told we want to get to is the same. So like you said, you came from kind of more of a like lower to middle class family and upbringing. And so the messaging you got was like, this is the kind of corporate life and corporate jobs and careers you need to go after to live a different type of life, like to pull yourself out of that. I came from what I would say more like middle to upper class life. And it was like, there was no other option. Like it was not even a question. It was kind of like, this is what everybody does. So it's like, whether it's positioned to us as changing the norm we're used to, or just staying in the norm without realizing there are other options. Like either way, we're kind of, so many of us are brought up thinking or with a very narrow definition of what careers look like in adulthood.
Totally. And even like what you pursue in your free time for fun. I feel like it was, growing up in my town, pretty much everyone was born near there, stayed there, and kind of followed this very clear path. And I'm sure many people can relate to this. But I think it's really interesting because when I got to college and was exposed to all of these different things, it was still really scary to step off of what that path looked like, regardless of if I saw so many different other options. It was definitely something that didn't even seem like a possibility for me other than to follow like the path.
Yeah. So when you first graduate and you coming into adulthood, like what are the things that you struggled with? Like what were some of those, if you went back and read some of those initial blogs, like what were the first things that you were kind of like, what the F? Like this is how life is?
Yeah, totally. Oh my gosh. Yes. I've went back and read a lot of those journal entries that I had and would scribble down on the subway quite frequently as I was writing, over the past year. But I think that there were a couple of things that really bubbled up to the surface for me. One was around this idea of happiness, which I think is quite interesting, and we could kind of dive into it more later. But I think, at least in my family and my upbringing, I was always told, of course, try to achieve all these things, but happiness should be your end goal. Like, we just want you to be happy. And I think that messaging is kind of passed along in a lot of different aspects of society. So when I got to adulthood and arrived on these steps of, what I thought was the rest of my life, I thought that happiness was something that I could achieve. And it was something that I could grab as a trophy, just as I had in so many aspects of my life that far. And nothing I was doing was making me happy. I was like, where do I find this happiness that everyone talks about? I was happy before, I think, but I'm not happy now, and I feel like I should be. So I think that was a really big, eye-opening aspect of adulthood for me, was that you don't just arrive and like everything's good.
Well, and I think like what you just said about like, I'm not happy and I should be, like, I think that's a big component of it too. Like, at least it was for me, because you look at your life on paper and it's like, okay, I got the college degree. Okay, I got the job, and, I have some kind of living arrangement, and maybe I have a social life and friends, and like, check, check, check. And I go to happy hour, whatever it is, like, I go to the gym, like, and so on paper, you're like, I'm doing all the things. I should be happy. And instead of thinking, what's wrong with my definition of happiness, we think like, what's wrong with me?
Yes, totally. I couldn't agree more. And it's so interesting because for some of the research I've recently done for the book, I did a lot of thinking on this topic. And there's this really interesting woman. She's a psychologist and she's a columnist in The Atlantic, and her name is Lori Gottlieb. And she wrote a book, How to Land Your Kid in Therapy. And she talks about starting to notice this as a common theme, especially for millennials, as they started to enter her therapist's office. And it was that everyone had all of these amazing things, this great upbringing, all this stuff that they were collecting, but they just didn't feel happy. And I think that that's a really common theme for a lot of millennials and, Gen Z, especially as they enter the workforce, because they get to this point where they thought that they've, done all the stuff right. And they're looking to achieve happiness, myself, and I'm sure yourself included. And obviously, as you said, we have to shift our definition of that.
So then how did you come around to realizing like happiness didn't live on the outside, or was it more, it can live on the outside, but it's a matter of like changing the rules that you live by.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I feel like that question is like the crux of the past 6 years or more for me. I feel like we could have 7 podcasts about this, but I think the first thing that it really started with for me, because I was working so much and I didn't have anything else to focus on, was that work wasn't making me happy. And also that I felt like we're constantly told, find your passion and do what you love, and then you will be happy. And that was clearly not happening for me. So I definitely think that as I really got honest with myself about what I wanted my life to look like versus what everyone else told me my life should look like, that was the starting point for me of kind of questioning everything and starting to really understand, like, what do I want to do, both in terms of my career and also my life? Do I have the courage to actually act on that? And then also, like, at the end of it, what are the feelings that I want to have throughout my life? And happiness doesn't need to be the end all be all. Like, there could be and should be many other feelings that I experience throughout, the rest of my however many years that I'm living. So it was a multi-layer process for sure.
Yeah. And so that concept of questioning everything, it's funny. That was the beginning of a huge turning point in my life as well. And it was this big process of like, okay, what ways of how I'm living my life, the decisions I've made, my current, situation, how I live my life, what I do with my time, what I do with my job, like all of that. It's like, what if it feels like it's really me, and what is just something I went along with because I thought I was supposed to, or that's what everyone else was doing, or that's what people wanted for me, or whatever. So that, I think that initial step of just starting to question things is like that first, like, opening of the door to any kind of change.
Totally. I couldn't agree more. And it's interesting because for me, obviously, and I know for all of us, this doesn't happen overnight. And when I think about what really prompted that for me, it was long before I started work. And it's interesting because I had mentioned before that I graduated a semester early. And what I did with that time was really just almost like what I call a pre-adult honeymoon. And instead of following the rules like I normally would have and expected for myself, I actually decided to travel during that time. And I had studied abroad and done all that stuff, but this was the first time that I kind of like bucked the system. And it was really interesting because I had this job offer that was starting in the summer. I had interned at this bank the summer before, and they gave me the option of starting work in January once I finished school. And a normal, person, and many of my colleagues did this, especially because I had loans to pay, would have taken that offer. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to take some of my savings from graduating a semester early and take myself on a 4-month trip through Australia and New Zealand and see where that takes me. And I think that experience was honestly the most life-changing experience for me, just because I started to see that like there are many other options other than this path that's set out for me, and people are really fulfilled, and like you don't need to have all these achievements and things in order to be happy, going back to that thought. So I think it really planted the seed for me that I can actually question what was happening once I got to adulthood.
Yeah, I'm sure that like played a huge role because it opens your mind and like broadens your perspective. Like we only know what we know and like what we've encountered in our life and what we've seen and the people like kind of that are in our circle or whatever. And it's like, yeah, you can watch the news and movies and stuff, but there's something different about really going places, talking to people, seeing the way other people live their life that just like totally opens your mind. And then once you see that kind of stuff, you can't unsee it. So like that seed is planted, like, and it wasn't going anywhere.
Totally. I couldn't agree more.
Okay, so I think though a lot of people feel what you were feeling and what I was feeling, especially as they're new into adulthood, and then maybe even sometimes for a long part of their life and their career.
Totally.
Why do you think it's so hard to start to question things? And then I guess that's kind of like the first question, because then even once we start to question things, then comes the whole process of actually making changes, which comes with its own like set of scaries. So we'll start with like, why do you think people avoid even thinking about or seriously entertaining like making certain changes in their lives and careers?
Oof, that's a good question. I think you kind of hinted at your question, right? Which is that it's really scary. Like it takes a lot of effort to start to question things, because you're not just questioning like simple stuff like, what if I took a different commute, right? And maybe you even start with something really simple. But the questioning process really begins to uncover so many deeper layers that sometimes we're not ready to look at. And I think that is actually totally okay. I think that the process of becoming awake and becoming more conscious and mindful about all of your decisions in life is something you have to mentally be ready for. And I think that you can totally be aware of wanting to make change or like wanting to start to question everything and not necessarily follow through with it yet. And I use follow through in the sense that like follow through with actually starting to reflect and become aware and starting to question. And that process happens before taking action. But I think that you have to dedicate a large part of yourself to becoming consistently aware of what maybe the beliefs that you had in your life or have in your life, and if they still hold towards the person that you want to be. So I'm actually a big believer that like you don't need to push yourself to do anything, and it should come from a really authentic and genuine place within you, because otherwise you're going to only be doing it for those external reasons that we're trying to shift to begin with.
Yes. Okay. I have like my hands in the air. I love that answer so much because I totally agree. Just the awareness of the unhappiness, the awareness of the, maybe I should make some changes, or maybe I should do some thinking to figure out how I got here in my life. That in itself is a step in the process. And it's like, we think it's not because it's not an action oriented step, but it is. Like no change ever happens without awareness first. And if you have to sit in that place of awareness for years, then so be it. And I think like exactly what you just said, like towards the end is like, it seems so contradictory, but I think change only ever happens when you just first fully accept where you are. Like to just total like self-acceptance of not in a giving up kind of way, but more in a I understand and accept and am okay with where I currently am in life. And it's like something about that then, I don't know, like starts the wheels of change. At least that's what I've experienced with me.
Totally. I couldn't agree more. And I think that it's really interesting, even just some insight into my own process was I spent a long time, like at least a year, just being really sad and frustrated. Like, I feel like I would pretty much wake up every day and get on the subway, chug my coffee at 6 a.m. and have all these bags around me and be like, I can't believe I'm doing this again. And I sat on that place for a long time. Like, I did not move into the process, as you said, of the awareness of like, number one, this can change. Number two, like, what do I want to change? Like, what aspects of it need to shift for me? And then getting to the process of actually taking action on it. And I think, I'll say that I go through that process consistently, like pretty much on a daily basis. I'm always questioning. But I think that it really does take a lot of effort and headspace. And, you don't need to do it if you don't want to. And I think that that's something that is hopefully a little bit comforting to people who are like, yeah, this sucks, the position that I'm in, but I'm not really ready to confront it yet. That's totally okay.
Yeah. And I think it comes down to like being really honest with ourselves, which is hard to do. And we're not really taught to do that. Like, we're not really taught to trust ourselves. We're taught to trust all these external things. And so I think a lot of us lose touch with that gut, intuition, self-awareness, relationship with self, whatever you want to call it. And because it's going to be in those moments where you're like, you're sitting on the subway and it's not even in your awareness yet that life could be different. And it's like, only in those moments if that's true, or if you're having that feeling and you're just suppressing it because, like, I don't know, my mind starts to like get a little bit lost trying to like wrap my brain around it, because it's such like subtle shifts of accepting where you are, yet also like being honest with yourself if you're not really being true to maybe what you actually are ready for. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And it's interesting, going back to one of the things you mentioned a couple of moments ago. Something that I thought was so interesting as I asked myself a lot of these questions as I was going through the writing process and kind of coming up with, what are the hardest parts of growing up and becoming conscious as you grow up about what you want and the life that you want to lead. And I don't know if you did this in middle school or high school, but they had us go through this process of like answering a bunch of questions, and then this computer generated program spit out these like top 5 answers of what you should be or what you should do as your career. And I just thought it was such an interesting example of how like our society works, and kind of hinting at what you just mentioned, where we look to all these external factors of how we should feel and what we should do and who we should be. And I kind of just questioned, what if we were taught to just come up with our own like personal mission statement, or ask ourselves, like, who do I want to be when I get older, or even right now in this moment? And I think that deep reflection and questioning really needs to start at a young age, but obviously for many of us, it may not have, and it's a muscle that we need to kind of exercise over time.
Yes, totally agree. It's like the exercises we should have been taken through. And I feel like maybe I did do something like that, but I cannot for the life of me remember what the answers were. But rather than something that has us answer some questions and then gives us the answer, like, here, you should be this or do this or whatever. The exercises should help us go deeper into ourselves and like pull those answers out of us, rather than like just push them at us. You know what I mean? Like, help us figure out what it is that we actually want, because that probably would have been a lot easier to do at that age without all the years and years of, piled on life experiences, which creates triggers and insecurities and like all this stuff that now you get to like where you're quote unquote becoming an adult. And it's even that much harder because you got all these layers of life piled on you.
Yeah, Totally. I couldn't agree more. And I think something that's really interesting about the time we're living in right now, like in this moment, and, any transition, like entering adulthood, moving to a new city, whatever it is, a lot of times those external factors prompt us to start to exercise that muscle. And really ask, like, whoa, now that this is the case, like, is this who I want to be or what I want to be doing? So I think there are times that, like, externally we will be forced into certain situations to start to, like, exercise that muscle. But obviously, as we kind of have been talking about for the past few minutes, is that, like, it only really happens if you're open to it.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, you have to be open to it. And then I love referring to it as a muscle because it is. And when you first start to use it, like, it's going to be weak. And then again, you have to be okay with that and recognize that it is a process. And like, the more you work that muscle, like, the stronger it'll get.
Totally. Yeah. And that's why it takes so much effort. It's like working out your brain.
It really is. It really is. And then you can work out too much, like I probably do, and just like overthink and overanalyze everything.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. My fiance is literally, his main comment to me is like, I think you should just stop thinking about that. Like, that is
like, just
probably a really good point.
Yeah,
exactly.
At least you share with him when you're like thinking about something. I usually like ponder everything just totally inside by myself and then end up like writing about it later. And everyone's like, "What? I had no idea you were going through this." I'm like, "Yeah, that's because I don't talk to anyone."
Yeah, totally. Oh my gosh, I know. I'm a introverted extrovert, so I feel like I'm always going back and forth.
Okay, so let's talk about the book. If you had to sum up kind of the main takeaway, like, what is the book about?
Great question, and I should have that answer right off the top of my head. But I think it's really summarizing so much what we talked about already. It's this idea of becoming more of who you want to be, not what. And that I asked that question a couple of times in the book, and I think it's such a important one because, at least for me personally, for so long I was asking, what do I want to be, like, in my career, in my relationships? And when I finally started to whittle away all of those layers that we've talked about, I realized that the question was really who. Like, who do I want to be as a person consistently all the time, no matter what situation I'm in? And I think at the end of the day, that's really what the book gets at. And, it's not just my personal experience. There's a lot of psychological and neuroscience research in there, a lot of societal research about why we are the way we are. So it's not really just our fault. There's a lot of things that have happened, both, in the world writ large, but also like in the specific period in time that millennials and younger were born. Like, what was happening that has led us to all be this way? The, person who we talked about before that has all this stuff, achieved all these things, but still doesn't quite feel happy. And then we dive into a lot of exercises, both from like a big strategic level of getting to really that question of who do you want to be, both from a career perspective, from a relationship perspective, from a financial perspective. And we do a lot of those reflection exercises together, just like, we're talking. And then at the end, the last part of it is about how do you start to make these changes right now? So what are the small things, small practices that you could start to incorporate into your everyday life to start inching closer to that person that you want to be? Because I think it's really easy, and I'm sure you're similar to me in this sense, to like sit in your reflections all day and like work on all these exercises and like come up with this big picture of, the life that you want to lead. And then your everyday life is like, what the hell am I doing? Like, why? As my life looks exactly the same. So I think it's really important to get tactical about these small shifts we could start to make to exercise that muscle.
Okay, I love that. And I want to talk about some of those. But first, I love the who versus what, because I kind of had a little aha moment when you were saying that. Because if you think about it, like even just when we meet new people and we're out, we're talking, we ask like, what do you do? We don't ask like who you are. We're just constantly defining each other or really only interested in like what someone does, not who they are. And then if we did ask like, who are you? All of us would probably answer with things like I'm a whatever your role in your job is.
Yeah.
Um, I'm a mother, or I'm an aunt, I'm a
Mhm.
friend, I'm a fiance, I'm a wife, like whatever it is. Like we
Mhm.
have all these like what we are, not kind of the deeper levels of like who who we are, which I guess ties into kind of our values and what's
Yeah.
important to us and like how we want to show up in the world. And I don't know, those I feel like it's getting better, but those conversations just aren't always the normal conversation. Everything stays a
Mhm.
little bit more like surface level, which then gives us all an excuse not to ever think about it ourselves.
Yes, yes, I couldn't agree more. And I think it's so interesting because one of the stories that I talk about in the book was me during this like year, first year of entering the working world. And I was so, just like struggling so much really with my internal perception of myself versus what like I thought this was whole thing was going to be. Because I feel like, at least in my upbringing, it always seemed like once you got to adulthood, you were just like this person that you know, worked so hard to be, and everything just fell into place. And when I got here, I was like, I felt like the curtains were pulled back, and I was like, oh, like, so we don't like talk about our dreams and hopes. We just like kind of
No,
stay
those are
in
gone. You
this.
just go to work every day.
Yeah, I felt like all I was doing was like running to the printer or like just living this very like mediocre, classic, like on the hamster wheel type of life. And it was really interesting because the people that I worked with, and, they were great in so many ways, but also all I looked up to see was that they kept negotiating their values. And that's something that I use a lot in the book, is this idea of like negotiating who you want to be to fit into these realms of what exists in the world. So you ask like, how's your weekend? Or, what do you do? Or what do you do for fun? Those types of basic questions. And I think it made me feel like there was no room to grow, not even just at work, but in life. And it wasn't until I had this one random evening, drinks with this girl I went to college with that I didn't know well at all and thought was very much going to be this surface level conversation. And for some reason, she picked me to like share all of her deepest life, confusions and struggles with. And I was like, oh my God, someone else feels like me. I am not alone in this. And I think that the moment that you find that one person, whether it's in a book or, in a conversation with someone at work or a random person from college, you start to realize that many more people feel like what we're talking about versus, than what they may present to the outside world.
Oh my gosh, for sure. Which is why I'm just such a believer in sharing our stories, and which is why
Mhm.
I wrote and published my book, which similar
Mhm.
to you was like just a public journal. Cause I was just like, I know I can't be alone in feeling like this. And so if it'll bring anyone else some solace to know like they're not alone, then it was
Mhm.
worth it, you know, whatever shame or insecurities came from kind of airing all my dirty laundry. But I love how you say that, like negotiating values, because I think, and it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier. If we aren't clearly defined ourselves in who
Mhm.
we are and like what our values are, then that's what leaves room for negotiation. Versus if we know and like feel really good about who we are and we've spent the time to figure that out and figure out what feels right to us and define that and like commit to it, then
Mhm.
like there is no room for negotiation, and you're able to answer any questions about, what you did over the weekend or how you feel about whatever, and stay kind of strong and rooted in who you are. And
Yeah.
I like that phrase though, negotiating values. I have a
Yeah.
thought though about the millennials, and
Hmm.
I never really know what I am or who I am. I'm either an elder millennial or I'm really young, Gen Y, Gen
Yeah.
wait,
What is
yeah,
it?
X.
Gen X.
I always
Yeah.
get confused. All of them, yeah, Gen X. So depending on like where you think the cutoff is, like I kind of
Yeah.
straddle the two generations. But a recent guest pointed out that for millennials, like I remember life without the internet and without
Yeah.
cell phones. And so it was landlines and you'd leave the house and there was no like, you know, trying to find time to be unplugged because there just wasn't phones, and internet was like this dial up thing. And it was different. Like I remember that in my lifetime. Whereas like
Totally.
the millennial generation has grown up, I think, in a much more connected world with all of
Mm.
social media and technology. And like while in some instances that's a good thing, you can argue the connection is a good thing, but also like you just saw so much more of other people's lives. And so,
Mm.
which allowed you to then form these assumptions and definitions of what your life would look like. Whereas before social media and all that, we really just saw the adult lives of the adults we encountered. And then, as you went off to college or went into the workforce, that expanded. But when you were younger, like you weren't scrolling through feeds looking at all these different photos. And I mean, this is something we all battle with social media, is
Mhm.
comparing our lives to the highlight reel of our friends and second cousins, uncles,
Yeah,
brothers, sister-in-law,
literally.
like all that stuff. And so it's like you guys grew up inundated with
Yeah.
that. And I wonder if that plays a role in it. Did that come up in
Mhm.
any of your research for the book?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think actually you may be in the millennial generation. I think that we specifically grew up in the transitional phase of technology as we know it today. So we weren't necessarily like in middle school scrolling on Instagram. We definitely had, if anyone listening remembers, AIM messaging. That was definitely
Mm-hmm.
a thing that you like ran home to update your away message for. But we were still in the age group where like it's not like it is today where everyone has a TikTok and like is famous for sure.
Yeah.
um, but I think interestingly, a lot of this group got into adulthood during that time, which is when we start to like really wake up and kind of question, as we were talking about before, a lot of things and start to fall into that comparison trap. So I think actually the more interesting aspect of what like ties, let's say even end of Gen X to beginning of Gen Z together is this different type of parenting that happened because of shifts in our like economic and social status in the world. So a lot of our parents probably grew up in this permissive parenting where their parents let them go out to play on the block and, things of that nature, and weren't really necessarily controlled all the time. And that was because college was more of an option because
Mm-hmm.
of the way that our economic standing was in the world, where if you graduated from college versus if you didn't, there wasn't such a major pay gap in your career. But as we all started to be born and grow up, regardless of how your parents were raised, we started entering this new phase of parenting where everyone was enrolled in extracurriculars and started to kind of collect a resume from the time we were young, if we realized it or not. And I think that, from my research at least, has had a really interesting effect on our perception of success and achievement and our standing, our individual standing in society. So I think that really impacted the millennial generation a ton. And there will obviously be a lot of studies and research on Gen Z and younger, especially because they're so connected to social media. But yeah, I think that is the aspect I'm focused on.
Yeah, that's really interesting because then, yeah, it's like you're starting to build this resume super young, and you're probably aware of why you're doing it because it looks good on your college applications and then, whatever. And so then that even starts to tie your value and your worth to things that you do, like what you do versus just who you are. That's really interesting.
Yeah, there was this really interesting study. It's very famous and the name is escaping me, but it was conducted at Stanford. I'm sure you know it. It was the marshmallow experiment. And these psychologists basically took these young children that were 4 or 5 into a room, and they had them they had a marshmallow on the table, and they told them that they'll be right back. The adult in the room will be right back. Don't eat the marshmallow yet, and you'll get something special afterwards if you don't eat it. And, it was a very short study. They saw which kid decided to not have any self-control and eat the marshmallow, and which kids waited and followed the rules. And then it didn't just end there. They tracked these children well into adulthood and measured their quote unquote levels of success based on this success metric that these researchers came up with. So like what types of jobs did they have, their, perception of their happiness and things like that. And what the researchers found was that the kids who waited to have the marshmallow supposedly did better in their metrics of success. So those who delayed gratification tended to do better following the rules of the world. And as I read that study and kind of compared it to this, shift in parenting and the shifts in the way we were raised, as you said, where we kind of tied our self-worth in these achievements and kind of delaying gratification, I actually saw that as a problem. I thought that, we're basically training kids to delay their own feelings and needs based on these rules that are set by society. And obviously in some ways that is helpful, but in a lot of ways it's led to us, our generation and the generations below us, who have achieved all these things and still are delaying how they feel about them. And I think that ties directly to, how we define our values and who we see ourselves to be. So I kind of advocate in the book for, not delaying our gratification, and not even just gratification, but really kind of tying our feelings and perceptions and reflections to our experiences in the moment.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I have heard of that study before. I think was it that if they don't eat one marshmallow, then they got like more marshmallows later or something? Did they test them with like additional marshmallows?
It was a treat of some kind that they got afterwards.
Because I think there's been similar studies like that. But you're right. It's like we're valuing then just like blindly following a rule that doesn't make any sense, which I recognize, like, rules and children, that's a whole other topic. That's not what I'm getting at. It's more like, rather than, okay, here are your options, child, which one feels right to you? Like maybe you don't want the other treat, or you don't want 2 marshmallows. I just want a marshmallow now. Like, but kind of like understanding your options, choosing what feels best for you, and then living with the consequences.
Yes, 100%. And I think that that's something that we only learn. And I'm not necessarily saying, as 5 years old, this is how we have to raise children. But I think it just says a lot about the world that we're operating in. And, for all of us, whoever is listening to this, like beginning to question if that's what you want for yourself and how you define success or, the values that you live by. So I think it's just
Yeah,
an
no,
example. Yeah.
I love it. I agree. And I mean, I'm kind of a walking example. So I left a very well-paying job at 34 years old. I'm now 36, by society's definition, pretty poor, struggling entrepreneur. But I view myself right now more successful than I was when my bank account wasn't nearly as stressed.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's really interesting. That's something that we kind of work through. I'm saying we as if like I have friends in this book, but that's kind of how the style of the writing is. But I think that is such an important point, because similarly, having worked in finance and left it, for philanthropy and then to start my own businesses, I personally realized that financials, like I needed a certain amount, but that wasn't the thing that was going to make me personally feel really good. And I think other people can decide differently, and they may say, like, this affords me to do all of these things, so I will make that trade-off. But what I call it in the book is the wealth nourishment pyramid. And I think a lot of times we view finances, especially in money, as something that like will run out forever if we're not always focused on it, instead of seeing it as a trade-off to other things that we can experience or do. So on that note, I couldn't agree more. Similarly to you.
That brings up a good point of just, our relationship with finances, and we're kind of all grown to put money on this, or we're all grown up like to put money on this pedestal of like money affords happiness, whatever. And I'm not discounting the importance of money for, basic living and the opportunities it can afford and all that stuff. I probably at this point in time in my life have like a bad relationship with money that I need to work through, because I almost resent it because I spent so many years chasing it, and the trade-off was like my happiness. So I think it's more, it kind of goes back to just recognizing what role do you want that to play in your life? Like what feels right for you versus kind of however we're taught growing up, or however kind of society teaches us to view money, along with careers, along with relationships. I mean, we could take this concept and like apply it to all aspects of life.
Oh my gosh, yes. I was going to say, as we start to question everything, anything fits under those questions. So
yeah, exactly. That's perfect. It's back to the beginning of the conversation, like question everything.
Exactly. Oh my gosh, yes. And yeah, I feel like that is something I consistently am going through personally, and also am like deeply interested to understand how, we apply that from a psychological perspective to everything that we do, and like where we draw the line and kind of feel fulfilled in that question. Going back to some of the things we said before about continuing to overthink and over-reflect, and like, when do we just be in the moment?
Yeah. Yep. When do we just be? I know. I'm working on that. Okay. So I want to end with kind of going back to, you mentioned some like tactical small practices. And I think sometimes, conversations like this, they can be very invigorating and inspiring and energizing. And then sometimes then you're like, oh, you're looking at this like mountain of changes that you want to make, and you can't tackle them all at once. Like it's only ever one step at a time. And I totally agree with you that starting with some very small steps can be like an important, like those small wins is good for your mindset. Then you get some motivation going and like some momentum. So what are some of those like small practices that you recommend?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I couldn't agree more. I feel like I always like write out all these massive changes I want to make and then get stuck in the actual action of them. But there are a couple of different aspects that I talk about in the book. I think two of the most interesting ones I'll pull out now are around the idea of having fun and collecting joy, which I think is often forgotten a lot when we enter this hamster wheel of adulthood, right? We're always like, when am I doing the next thing? Even when you're having fun, you're not having fun because you're trying to show other people that you're having fun. So I think that that's a really big one that I tackle in the book. And I think if I wasn't, as clear about this throughout this conversation, hopefully people can pick up on it, but I'm very much a believer of like going with your intuition and doing things when you feel it's right. But I actually feel the opposite about having fun. And research shows that you actually need to schedule it into your day. And even the anticipation of looking forward to doing something fun is about 30% of the fun that you have. So I think a takeaway for people listening to this is to truly schedule something inspiring or lighthearted or something without a purpose into your schedule, whether that's once a week or once a day or once a month, whatever it looks like for you, but really being intentional about that, because when you allow yourself to experience the joys of life, you start to look for them more. And we know that based on research that as you expose yourself to a certain type of thinking, our brains continue to collect that type of thinking more and more. We build new neural pathways to do it. So
I love that. Collect joy. That's a good one.
Exactly. And there's so many others. I think the last one I'll kind of end off with here is there's a really big perception around gratitude, and everyone talks about this. And I know when I was starting to kind of reshift my life and, stop being in this headspace of hating and, disliking my everyday, all I read about were these gratitude practices. And I was like, what is gratitude? Why is everyone talking about it? It feels like something I should hear about at church. What is going on? And I think there's this a lot of really interesting new research on this, but I love this psychologist and PhD's view of it, Dr. Shapiro. She talks about this idea of heartfulness, and it's really honestly connected to, a lot of Eastern traditions and religions, but it's this idea of viewing everything you do with love and even acknowledging yourself with love every single day, and going back to this idea of shifting our brain to see things with love and fun and joy is really happens when we act in that way consistently, even in the small moments where you're like, why is it pouring rain on the one time I get to go outside today? Instead, viewing it as something lovely and adventurous and enjoyable, and really noticing your thought patterns around that.
I love that. And I'm a big believer in gratitude, because I started to do more research into it too, because I'm like, why is this a thing? And then it does tie to feelings, because it's, you can think about gratitude, and yes, that is important to start to rewire your brain to find the positive in things. There's absolute value in that. But I think where the magic really happens is that heartfulness and moving the gratitude from your head to your heart, and actually being able to feel the gratitude and the love or the joy. And that is something, it's funny because this same topic kind of came up in an interview I did yesterday with a guest. It'll air later in November, but about how we're not even really that good at and comfortable with really sitting in and feeling those good, positive feelings, because we tend to be more stuck in the negative and super busy. And so it's when you when you schedule the time for the joy or you're doing your gratitude practice, to try and really like just sit and pause and like just relish in those positive feelings. Like that again is another muscle that then you'll get better at being able to feel that, and you'll feel it more frequently. And then that's a more fun life.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I could not agree more. I think it's really interesting because, at least for me, it helps me to know why I am a certain way, number one, and number two, that I'm like not alone in being that way. And I think going to your idea of how we tend to live in the negative, like obviously that actually is true. And that's the way that our brains are structured in order to keep us safe. And there's a chapter in the book that's about how our world is truly getting better, even though it doesn't feel like it. And it's the safest time to take a risk, even if your brain is holding on to the negative. And I think it's really interesting, as you said, to start to begin to notice that and see how your perception shifts over time if you just commit to practicing to it consistently.
For sure. And to kind of just go back to the beginning again and tie this all up with a nice little bow, like questioning, like when you've got all that negativity and you've got all these fears, because that's what our brain is wired to do. And it's a survival instinct. It's not a bad thing, but it doesn't work well in this, for the most of us, safe environment we live in. It's like when you start to catch your brain go down that, like, just question it, be like, is that really true? Like, do I know that that's going to happen if I make this decision or if I go do this thing? And then you'll start to realize, okay, no, I don't really know that. I'm assuming it. And the opposite is as equally as possible.
Totally.
Okay, awesome. Well, I can't thank you enough for this conversation. This is just, I don't know, this was a really fun one. I feel for anyone who is currently in a chapter of life where they're struggling and they just feel off and they don't know what to do. I have a friend of mine I ran into recently at a coffee shop he's in that phase. And I was just like, I feel for you because I've been there. I know exactly how hard it is, but I also know like you can get out of it and you will get out of it. And it's part of the process, and it's all for your own good in the end. And luckily there are books like yours that now exist to help people through these time periods. So tell everybody like where they can find you, follow you, and get the book. It's not out yet, is it?
No.
Okay. When does it come out?
Yeah. It comes out on November 24th. So very soon. But you can pre-order it, obviously up until that point, and it will ship out on that day. And then, it should be anywhere that you find books. Also, it's available on my website in a limited amount that I'll be signing. So hopefully it will still be available when this airs, but you could grab that pre-order on my website at onadulting.com. And thank you so much for having me. This honestly has been so amazing. And of course, anyone listening who wants to learn more or connect with me, I would be so happy to chat with you. So you can find me on Instagram at onadulting, and then obviously my website.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. This was so much fun.
All right, that'll do it for this week's episode. Thank you again for tuning in. I hope you all enjoyed this conversation. Don't forget to message me either on social media. We are on Facebook and Instagram at The Better You Podcast, or you can email me at thebetteryouPodcast@gmail.com and let me know what your favorite episode has been so far. And that'll help me decide what our best of rerun episodes will be in December. Also, remember, I will link to all the things I talked about in the intro. Those will all be in the show notes. So if you're interested in checking any of that out, just go to the show notes and you'll find links for everything. And as always, I want to ask that if you've been enjoying the show, or if you enjoyed this episode in particular, then please take a minute to leave the podcast a rating and a review. That helps a lot, and I'll very much appreciate it. I'd love to see feedback on what you guys are thinking and what you're enjoying and all of that. So that is it, I believe. Thank you again. Have a wonderful rest of your week.